The Montana sunrise painted the sky in shades of orange and pink as Harold Peterson shuffled to his front porch, coffee mug in his weathered hands. At 93, his movements were slower than they used to be, but his blue eyes remained sharp as ever, taking in the peaceful scene before him. His modest white house, standing faithfully for over 5 decades, sat just off rural Route 7, a winding road that snaked through the picturesque Montana countryside. The property wasn't large, just under an acre, but Harold maintained it with the same precision he'd learned during his military service all those years ago. Every morning followed the same cherished routine. Harold would wake at exactly 6 a.m., a habit he couldn't shake from his army days. After making his coffee, black, no sugar, he would sit on his porch swing, watching the world come alive. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of pine trees that surrounded his property. Mrs. Jenkins, his neighbor from 3 houses down, would wave as she collected her morning paper. "Morning, Harold," she'd call out, and he'd raise his coffee mug in response. They'd been neighbors for 30 years, and she always made sure to check on him since his wife, Martha, passed away 5 years ago. The local diner, Jenny's Place, had become Harold's second home. The staff knew his order by heart: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. Jenny, the owner's daughter, would always save him his favorite booth by the window. "The usual, Mr. Peterson?" she'd ask with a warm smile, though she already knew the answer. "The young folks around here could learn a thing or two from you, Mr. Peterson," Jenny would often say, watching him meticulously arrange his napkin and silverware. "They don't make them like you anymore." Back at home, Harold spent most of his days tending to his garden. Martha had loved flowers, and he kept her garden blooming in her memory. The roses were her favorite, and he talked to them as he pruned, just like she used to do. Sometimes, passing neighbors would hear him sharing stories with the flowers about his days in the war or about the adventures he and Martha had shared. His garage held his most prized possession, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, maintained in pristine condition. Every Saturday, he would polish its chrome trim until it gleamed like a mirror. The car had been his and Martha's first major purchase as a married couple, and he couldn't bear to part with it. Rural Route 7 had always been quiet, perfect for an elderly veteran seeking peace in his golden years. Occasionally, motorcycles would pass by, their riders enjoying the scenic route. Harold didn't mind them at first. He even waved sometimes, remembering his own younger days of adventure. But lately, things had been changing. The peaceful road was becoming increasingly popular with motorcycle groups. The quiet mornings were now frequently interrupted by the roar of engines, sometimes so loud they rattled the windows of his house. Harold noticed more and more bikers stopping along the road, leaving behind cigarette butts and empty beer cans. One particular group had started showing up regularly, their loud bikes decorated with intimidating symbols. They would park near his property, playing music that shook the ground and shouting conversations that made Harold wince at their crude language. Despite the growing disturbance, Harold maintained his dignity. He continued his routines: morning coffee, breakfast at Jenny's, tending to Martha's roses. But there was a tension building in the air, like the static before a storm. "You should report them," Mrs. Jenkins suggested one morning, concerned about the increasing biker presence. But Harold just shook his head. He'd survived World War II. He wasn't about to let a group of noisy bikers drive him from his home. Little did anyone know that behind Harold's quiet demeanor and gentle smile lay the spirit of a warrior who had trained hundreds of soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. His neighbors saw a kind, elderly man who fed local stray cats and shared his homegrown tomatoes. They didn't see the medals locked away in his attic, or notice how he still did his military exercises every evening, maintaining his strength and discipline even at 93. As Harold sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the Montana mountains, he could hear the distant rumble of motorcycles approaching. His weathered hands gripped his coffee mug a little tighter, but his face remained calm. He had survived wars, loss, and hardship. Whatever came next, Harold Peterson would face it with the quiet strength that had carried him through 93 years of life. The trouble began on a warm Tuesday afternoon when a group of 12 bikers, calling themselves the Road Raiders, decided to make Harold's stretch of rural Route 7 their regular hangout spot. Their chrome motorcycles gleamed menacingly in the sun as they parked directly across from his mailbox, their leather jackets adorned with aggressive symbols. Harold watched from behind his living room curtain as they lounged against their bikes, tossing empty beer cans onto his carefully maintained lawn. The leader, a tall man with a scraggly beard and a skull bandana, seemed to take particular pleasure in being as disruptive as possible. "Hey, old-timer," the leader shouted when he spotted Harold retrieving his mail. "Nice place you got here. Be ashamed if something happened to it." The other bikers laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Harold said nothing, simply collecting his letters with steady hands, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The next day, they returned with more members. The peaceful afternoon air was shattered by the thunderous roar of their engines as they deliberately revved them while passing Harold's house. Mrs. Jenkins from next door came over, wringing her hands in worry. "Harold, this isn't right," she said, watching the bikers through his kitchen window. "We should call the sheriff." Harold calmly poured her a cup of tea. "The sheriff's station is understaffed, Sarah. They've got bigger problems than some noisy bikers." But the situation escalated quickly. One morning, Harold found his mailbox knocked over, its post snapped clean in half. Tire tracks in his grass told the story clearly enough. He spent the morning replanting Martha's flowers that had been crushed under motorcycle wheels, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the anger building inside him. Jenny from the diner noticed something was wrong when Harold barely touched his breakfast. "Those troublemakers giving you grief again, Mr. Peterson?" she asked, refilling his coffee cup. The whole town had started talking about the bikers and their increasing boldness. "Nothing I can't handle, Jenny," Harold replied with a small smile, though his eyes had lost some of their usual warmth. The road raiders seemed to take Harold's silence as weakness. They began parking their bikes on his property, using his front yard as their personal gathering spot. Empty bottles and cigarette butts littered the ground where Martha's prize roses once bloomed undisturbed. One particularly hot afternoon, Harold stepped onto his porch and politely asked them to lower their music. The leader, who everyone called Spike, swaggered up to the porch steps. "What's that, Gramps? Can't hear you over the music," he sneered, deliberately turning the volume higher. The other bikers laughed, some making exaggerated gestures mimicking an old man with a cane. Harold stood straight, his 93 years seeming to fall away for a moment. "Young man," he said quietly, "I'm asking you respectfully to show some consideration." Spike climbed the porch steps until he was face to face with Harold. "And what if we don't want to be respectful?" he challenged, his breath reeking of beer. "What's a fossil like you gonna do about it?" The other bikers gathered around, expecting entertainment. They didn't notice how Harold's stance shifted slightly, or how his hands, though aged, showed no sign of trembling. Before Harold could respond, one of the younger bikers kicked over the potted plant by the steps, the last rose bush Martha had planted before she passed. The ceramic pot shattered, spilling soil across the porch Harold had swept clean that morning. A heavy silence fell. Even the bikers seemed to sense they'd crossed a line. Harold looked at the scattered dirt and broken flowers, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "I fought in World War II, so people like you could be free to make your own choices," he said quietly. "But freedom comes with responsibility." The bikers laughed, but there was a hint of unease in it now. Something in the old man's voice, and the way he held himself, suggested they might have misjudged him. "Whatever, old man." Spike scoffed, but he stepped back from the porch. "Come on, boys. Let's leave Grandpa to his gardening." As they roared away, Harold knelt down and carefully gathered the broken pieces of Martha's pot. His movements were precise, methodical, like a man making plans. In his younger days, he had taught soldiers how to handle themselves in combat. Now, watching the bikers disappear down the road, he realized some battles required a different kind of strength. The sun was setting over the Montana hills, casting long shadows across his violated front yard. Harold Peterson stood on his porch, surveying the damage, and made a decision. These young men had mistaken his kindness for weakness. It was time to show them just how wrong they were. The truth about Harold Peterson's military past began to surface one quiet morning at Jenny's diner. As Harold sat at his usual booth, an elderly man in a veteran's cap stopped dead in his tracks, coffee cup nearly slipping from his fingers. "Sweet Lord above," the man whispered, staring at Harold. "Your Staff Sergeant Peterson, the ghost hand of Camp Pendleton." The diner fell silent. Jenny, who was pouring coffee at a nearby table, turned to look at Harold with newfound curiosity. The old veteran approached Harold's table, standing straight despite his age. "Sir, you trained me in 45, taught us hand-to-hand combat before we shipped out to the Pacific. I never forgot what you said about strength being in the mind before it's in the muscles." Harold gestured for the man to sit down. His cover was blown. For decades, he kept quiet about his military achievements, preferring a peaceful life. But now, as the two veterans talked, the story of Harold's remarkable past began to unfold. During World War II, Harold hadn't just been any soldier. He'd been specially selected to train thousands of troops in close combat techniques. His methods were so effective that soldiers nicknamed him the Ghost Hand because of his ability to take down opponents twice his size without them even seeing the moves coming. He could disable a man in 3 moves, the veteran told the growing crowd of listeners in the diner. Trained over 5,000 soldiers. There were generals who wouldn't spar with him. Word spread quickly through the small town. Mrs. Jenkins nearly dropped her garden shears when she learned that her quiet neighbor, who helped her with her tomato plants, had once been legendary in military circles. The local newspaper even dubbed up an old photograph showing a younger Harold teaching combat techniques to a group of soldiers. What amazed people most wasn't just Harold's military record, but the fact that at 93 he still maintained his discipline. Every morning at 5 a.m., before his porch coffee routine, Harold went through a modified version of the same exercises he'd taught his soldiers. His movements were slower now, but the precision remained. In his garage, behind the pristine Chevy Bel Air, Harold kept a small workout area. Here, he practiced the breathing techniques and movement patterns that had made him legendary. The medicine ball he used was lighter now, the punching bag smaller, but his form was perfect. The body ages, he told his students years ago, but proper technique never does. His neighbors began to notice things they'd overlooked before. How he always seemed aware of his surroundings. How his movements, though slow with age, were perfectly balanced. The way he could still lift his own groceries when men 20 years younger needed help. The local VFW post commander, Bill Thompson, visited Harold one afternoon. As they sat on the porch watching the road raiders roar past, Bill shook his head in disbelief. "Those fools have no idea who they're messing with, do they, Sergeant?" Harold sipped his coffee. "It's not about fighting anymore, Bill. Those days are past." "But surely you could," Bill started. "Could I?" Harold interrupted quietly. "Yes, should I? That's a different question. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first. That's what I taught my soldiers." Yet, despite his peaceful intentions, Harold hadn't lost his edge. Every evening, after tending Martha's roses, he went through his routine. His hands, though weathered by time, could still strike with surprising speed. His balance, honed by decades of practice, remained rock steady. The local kids, who used to think of him as just another elderly resident, now watched him with wide-eyed wonder. They'd sneak peeks through his garage windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Ghost Hand in action. One morning, as Harold worked through his exercises, he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. The road raiders were returning, unaware that the quiet old man they'd been harassing was more dangerous than any of them imagined. Harold continued his movements, each one precise and controlled. He hadn't trained soldiers to fight out of aggression, but to protect themselves and others. Now, facing his own battle, he knew he would need all his wisdom to handle this situation properly. As the bikers' engines grew louder, Harold completed his routine with the same discipline he'd maintained for over 7 decades. The Ghost Hand of Camp Pendleton might have aged, but the warrior spirit that had earned him that name remained undiminished. The question wasn't whether he could stand up to the bikers. It was how to do it while staying true to the principles he'd spent a lifetime teaching others. The breaking point came on a sunny Wednesday afternoon. Harold was tending to his garden when the familiar roar of motorcycles filled the air. This time, the road raiders arrived with even more members, their bikes kicking up dust as they pulled onto his property. Spike, their leader, seemed particularly aggressive that day. He strutted across Harold's lawn, a half-empty beer bottle dangling from his fingers. His eyes fell on the American flag that Harold had flown every day since returning from the war. It was a special flag, presented to him by his unit before he left the service. "Hey boys," Spike called out, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Look at this old rag. Bet the old-timer thinks he's some kind of hero." Harold stood perfectly still, watching as Spike grabbed the flag's rope. The other bikers gathered around, laughing and jeering. With a sharp tug, Spike yanked the flag down, letting it fall into the dirt. Oops, Spike sneered, deliberately stepping on the flag. Guess it's seen better days, just like you, Gramps. For the first time since the harassment began, something changed in Harold's expression. His usually gentle blue eyes hardened, taking on the steel they'd held during his combat training days. He set down his gardening tools with deliberate care. That flag, Harold said, his voice quiet but carrying across the yard, was given to me by men braver than you'll ever know. Men who didn't come home. The bikers fell silent, caught off guard by the sudden change in the old man's demeanor. Even Spike took a step back, though he tried to hide it with a laugh. "What's wrong, old-timer? Did we hurt your feelings?" Spike taunted, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice now. Harold walked slowly toward the fallen flag, his movements measured and precise. The bikers parted unconsciously, something in his bearing making them step aside. He bent down and carefully picked up the flag, brushing off the dirt with gentle hands. "I'd spent my life teaching others to defend themselves," Harold said, folding the flag with military precision. "But more importantly, I taught them when not to fight. I taught them about honor, respect, and the price of freedom." Mrs. Jenkins had come out onto her porch, phone in hand, recording everything. Other neighbors were gathering too, drawn by the confrontation. The tension in the air was palpable. One of the younger bikers, barely out of his teens, shifted uncomfortably. "Hey Spike, maybe we should." "Shut up." Spike snapped, but his bravado was cracking. The old man before him didn't seem so helpless anymore. Harold finished folding the flag and looked directly at Spike. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of his years of command. "You threatened me, vandalized my property. Now you've disrespected this flag and the sacrifices it represents." Harold's eyes swept across the group. "I've faced worse than you in my time. Much worse, but I've never seen such disrespect from Americans toward their own." Several bikers looked down, unable to meet his gaze. A few others began quietly moving toward their motorcycles. "I won't fight you," Harold continued. "Not because I can't, but because I choose not to. You see, real strength isn't about how tough you act or how loud your bikes are. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Harold turned and walked back to his flagpole. With the same precision he'd shown in training thousands of soldiers, he raised the flag back to its proper place. When he turned around again, his face was set with determination. "This ends now," he said firmly. "Not with fists or violence, but with something you boys seem to have forgotten about. Consequences." From inside her house, Mrs. Jenkins was already calling the sheriff's office. Other neighbors had their phones out, recording the entire incident. The young biker who had spoken up earlier actually removed his hat, looking ashamed. Spike, trying to maintain his authority, opened his mouth to speak, but Harold cut him off with a look that had once commanded respect from hardened soldiers. "You have a choice to make," Harold said. "All of you, you can continue down this path, or you can remember who you are, Americans, like those who fought and died for that flag you just disrespected." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of distant thunder. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively, and Harold Peterson was ready to face it. He had spent decades teaching others how to fight, but now he would show them something even more important: how to stand up for what's right without throwing a single punch. Harold's military training had taught him that sometimes the best strategy wasn't a direct confrontation, but a carefully planned operation. The morning after the flag incident, he put his plan into action. First, he visited the local police station with a thick folder under his arm. Inside were dozens of photographs Mrs. Jenkins and other neighbors had taken of the road raiders' illegal activities. There were images of them drinking on his property, vandalizing his mailbox, and most importantly, the video of them desecrating the American flag. Sheriff Mike Thompson, a former Marine himself, reviewed the evidence carefully. "This is solid documentation, Mr. Peterson. Why didn't you come to us sooner?" Harold's response was characteristically modest. "I wanted to give them a chance to change their behavior on their own, Sheriff. Sometimes young men just need time to find their way." While at the station, Harold learned something interesting. The road raiders have been causing trouble in neighboring towns too. His detailed documentation was exactly what law enforcement needed to take action. But Harold wasn't done. That afternoon, he made a phone call to an old friend, Colonel James Martinez, who now led the local chapter of the Veterans Motorcycle Association. As Harold described the situation, the colonel's voice grew increasingly serious. "They did what to your flag?" Martinez's voice crackled with anger over the phone. "The one from your unit?" "Yes," Harold replied calmly. "But I'm not looking for revenge, James. I'm looking for justice." The colonel understood immediately. "We'll handle this the right way, Harold. The way you taught us." Over the next few days, Harold meticulously organized everything. He set up cameras around his property, positioning them carefully to catch any future incidents. He kept a detailed log of every interaction, every threat, and every act of vandalism. The local newspaper ran a story about Harold's military service, including interviews with several veterans he had trained. The article didn't mention the current situation with the bikers, but it painted a clear picture of who Harold Peterson really was, a respected combat instructor who had shaped the lives of thousands of soldiers. One morning, as Harold sat on his porch drinking coffee, he noticed something different. Two members of the Veterans Motorcycle Association were parked across the street, their bikes gleaming in the morning sun. They nodded respectfully when Harold raised his coffee mug in greeting. Throughout the day, more veterans arrived. They didn't make a show of force or cause any trouble. They simply positioned themselves strategically around the area, their presence calm but unmistakable. Some of these veterans were lawyers. Others were police officers or business owners. All of them had one thing in common: they understood the importance of handling this situation legally and properly. Harold's security cameras captured everything when the road raiders returned that afternoon. They slowed down as they approached, clearly surprised by the presence of the veteran bikers. The raiders' usual bravado seemed to deflate when they realized these weren't ordinary bikers. These were combat veterans, many wearing their service patches proudly. Colonel Martinez approached Spike and his group, his manner professional but firm. "Gentlemen, we need to have a discussion about respect, law, and consequences." Harold watched from his porch as Martinez handed Spike a thick envelope. Inside were copies of all the documentation Harold had collected, along with a letter from a veterans' legal aid group outlining the potential consequences of their actions. "Mr. Peterson could press charges," Martinez explained calmly. "The evidence is overwhelming, but he's willing to handle this another way if you're ready to make better choices." The road raiders looked at the photographs, the documented complaints, and the video of them disrespecting the flag. Their faces showed growing realization of just how serious their situation had become. "The choice is yours," Martinez continued. "But know this, from now on, every illegal action you take will be documented. Every threat, every act of vandalism will have consequences." Harold sipped his coffee, watching the scene unfold. He had trained soldiers to fight when necessary, but more importantly, he had trained them to think strategically. Sometimes the best victories were won without throwing a single punch. As the road raiders huddled together, discussing their options, Harold allowed himself a small smile. The discipline and strategic thinking he had taught for so many years were still serving him well. He had faced down his harassers not with fists or threats, but with something far more powerful: organized, legal, and irrefutable evidence of their wrongdoing. The battle wasn't over yet, but the tide had definitely turned. The transformation of Harold's quiet neighborhood was remarkable. Where once the road raiders had ruled through intimidation, now the Veterans Motorcycle Association maintained a respectful presence. Their bikes were clean, their behavior professional, and their purpose clear: protecting one of their own. Colonel Martinez had organized the veterans into shifts. Every few hours, new riders would arrive to replace those leaving, ensuring Harold's property was never unprotected. These weren't just any veterans. They were doctors, lawyers, business owners, and civil servants who happened to ride motorcycles. One morning, Jenny from the diner brought coffee and donuts to the veterans standing watch. "Mr. Peterson taught my father," she explained, setting down the boxes. "Dad said he was the best instructor the Army ever had." The veterans shared stories about Harold's influence on their lives. Some had trained directly under him, while others had learned from instructors he had taught. His techniques and principles had been passed down through generations of soldiers. "The ghost hand didn't just teach us how to fight," explained Mike Roberts, a gray-haired veteran who now owned a successful security company. He taught us how to think, how to analyze a situation, and most importantly, how to de-escalate conflict. The road raiders tried to return several times that week, but each time they found themselves facing a group of combat-trained veterans who stood their ground with quiet confidence. These weren't young troublemakers looking for a fight. These were experienced warriors who understood the true meaning of strength. One particularly tense moment came when Spike and his gang roared up to Harold's house, finding 6 veterans calmly drinking coffee on the lawn. The raiders revved their engines aggressively, trying to intimidate them. Captain Sarah Martinez, the colonel's daughter and a decorated combat veteran herself, simply walked over to Spike's bike. "Nice, Harley," she said conversationally. "You know, we're having a veterans charity ride next weekend. Could raise money for the local VA hospital. Interested in doing something positive with that bike?" Her calm demeanor and unexpected invitation caught Spike off guard. Some of his younger followers actually looked interested in the idea. Harold watched these interactions from his porch, noting how the veterans used the same principles he had taught them years ago. They maintained discipline, showed respect, and always offered a peaceful solution first. The veterans didn't just stand guard, they began cleaning up the mess the raiders had left behind. They replanted Harold's garden, fixed his mailbox, and even helped repaint his fence. Their presence transformed the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. Local children would stop by after school, fascinated by the veterans' motorcycles. Instead of frightening the kids like the raiders had done, these riders would share stories about service, respect, and the importance of standing up for what's right. "See that man there?" one veteran would tell the children, pointing to Harold working in his garden. "He taught us that true strength isn't about having power, it's about how you use it." The media began to take notice. A local news station ran a story about how veterans were coming together to protect one of their own. The reporter interviewed Harold, who characteristically downplayed his role. "These men and women understand something important," Harold told the camera. "They understand that protecting others isn't just about physical strength. It's about community, about standing together against wrongdoing." The road raiders' attempts at intimidation became increasingly half-hearted. It's one thing to harass an elderly man. It's quite another to face dozens of combat-trained veterans to meet your aggression with calm professionalism. One evening, as the sun set over the Montana hills, Harold sat on his porch with Colonel Martinez, sharing coffee and memories. "You know, sir," Martinez said, "what you taught us about combat all those years ago, it wasn't just about fighting. It was about standing up for what's right, about protecting those who need protection." Harold nodded, watching as another group of veterans arrived for the night shift. Their bikes purred quietly as they took their positions, a far cry from the aggressive roar of the raiders. "The best victories," Harold replied, quoting the words he had taught thousands of soldiers, "are the ones where nobody has to throw a punch." The veterans had transformed a situation that could have ended in violence into something positive. They showed the community what real strength looked like, not the loud, aggressive display of the raiders, but the quiet, disciplined presence of those who understood the true meaning of service. As darkness fell, the veterans' bikes gleamed under the streetlights, their riders standing watch over not just Harold's property, but over the principles he had spent a lifetime teaching. The story of Harold Peterson and the veterans who protected him spread far beyond their small Montana town. Social media buzzed with videos of the dignified old combat instructor and his guardian angels on motorcycles. Local businesses began putting up signs in their windows that read, "We stand with Harold and veterans strong." Jenny's Diner became an unofficial headquarters for community support. She created a special veterans breakfast discount and designated the corner booth as Harold's Corner, complete with a framed photo of him in his younger days training troops. "It's not just about Harold anymore," Jenny told her customers one morning. "It's about showing that our community won't tolerate bullying, no matter who the target is." The town's response was overwhelming. The hardware store donated materials to repair Harold's fence and mailbox. The local garden center delivered new rose bushes to replace those the raiders had destroyed. Even the high school's woodshop class made Harold a new handcrafted flagpole, stronger and taller than the old one. Mrs. Jenkins organized a neighborhood watch program, inspired by the veterans' example. "If these brave men and women can take time out of their busy lives to stand guard," she declared at the first meeting, "we can certainly keep an eye out for each other." The town's children were particularly moved by the situation. When they learned that Harold had trained soldiers to protect others, they started their own playground patrol, standing up to bullies and protecting younger kids. They called themselves Harold's Helpers. One morning, a school bus stopped in front of Harold's house. The fourth grade class filed out, each child carrying a hand-drawn card thanking him for his service and for showing them what real courage looked like. Their teacher, whose grandfather had been one of Harold's students, had taught them about standing up to bullies the right way. Mr. Peterson, a small girl, said, handing him her card, "When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." Harold knelt down carefully to her level. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he told her. "It means doing what's right even when you are scared." The local paper ran daily updates about the situation. They interviewed business owners who had been intimidated by the road raiders in the past but had been too afraid to speak up. Now, strengthened by the community's unity, they shared their stories. Social media played a crucial role too. Videos of the veterans standing guard went viral, drawing attention from national news outlets. One video, showing Harold calmly raising his flag each morning while veterans saluted, was shared millions of times. The town's mayor, seeing the community's response, called a special town council meeting. "What's happening here is bigger than one man's struggle," she announced. "It's about a community remembering its values and standing together against intimidation." The council passed new ordinances against harassment and noise pollution, giving the police better tools to deal with troublemakers. They also designated Harold Street as a Veterans Memorial Way, complete with new signs honoring service members. Local motorcycle clubs, inspired by the veterans' example, began distancing themselves from the road raiders. Several clubs issued statements condemning the raiders' behavior and pledging to promote responsible riding. "We're not all like them," declared the president of the local motorcycle association. "Most of us ride with respect for our communities and our neighbors." The change in the neighborhood was remarkable. Where once people had hurried indoors at the sound of motorcycles, now they watched with pride as veterans rode past on patrol. Children waved, seniors gave thumbs up, and the atmosphere of fear was replaced with one of community solidarity. Harold's daily routine remained the same: morning coffee on the porch, breakfast at Jenny's, tending his garden. But now he was surrounded by a community that had found its voice and its courage. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch with Colonel Martinez and several other veterans, Mrs. Jenkins brought over a fresh apple pie. The neighborhood children played safely in their yards, and the sound of friendly conversation filled the air. "You know what amazes me?" Martinez said, watching the peaceful scene. "All this started because they thought they could bully one old man. They had no idea they were taking on an entire community." Harold smiled, looking at the American flag flying proudly above his restored garden. The roses were blooming again, the lawn was healing, and most importantly, the neighborhood had discovered its own strength. "Sometimes," Harold replied, "it takes a challenge to remind people of who they really are and what they stand for." The sun set over Montana, casting long shadows across Veterans Memorial Way, where a community had learned that true strength lies not in intimidation, but in standing together against it. The final chapter of Harold Peterson's story began on a crisp autumn morning when Spike, the road raiders' leader, pulled up to Jenny's diner alone. His motorcycle's engine was quiet, and his usual aggressive demeanor was gone. He found Harold in his usual booth, having his morning breakfast. "Mr. Peterson," Spike said, removing his bandana and revealing a young face marked with uncertainty. "May I join you?" Harold gestured to the empty seat, studying the changed man before him. Spike sat down, his hands fidgeting with his coffee cup. "My grandfather was a veteran," Spike began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He passed last week. At his funeral, they presented our family with a flag, just like the one we—" His voice trailed off, shame evident in his expression. Harold remained silent, letting the young man find his words. "I found his military photos," Spike continued. "There was one from his training days. And sir, you were in it. You were his instructor." Jenny, who was nearby, almost dropped her coffee pot. Harold's blue eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "James Connor," Harold said softly, "tall boy from Nebraska, always helped the smaller recruits with their gear." Spike nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "That was my grandpa. He used to tell us stories about his tough but fair instructor who taught him more than just fighting. I never made the connection until now. The diner had fallen silent, everyone listening to this unexpected conversation. Sir, Spike straightened his shoulders. I came to apologize. Not just for the flag, but for everything. We dishonored everything my grandfather stood for. Everything you taught him. Harold reached across the table and placed his weathered hand on Spike's shoulder. Your grandfather was a good man. He would be proud to see you making things right. That afternoon, the road raiders returned to Harold's house one last time, but this time they came with rakes, shovels, and gardening tools. Led by Spike, they began restoring Harold's yard, planting new flowers, and repairing the damage they had caused. The veterans watched from their usual posts, nodding in approval as the raiders worked. Some even joined in, teaching the young bikers proper techniques for planting roses. These are called peace roses, Harold explained to Spike as they worked side by side. Martha loved them because they reminded her that beauty can grow even after difficult times. The transformation wasn't just in Harold's garden. The road raiders began changing their ways throughout the town. They organized motorcycle safety courses for young riders, participated in veteran charity rides, and even started a mentorship program with local veterans. At the next town council meeting, Spike stood up to address the community. We came to this town thinking we were strong because we could intimidate others, he admitted. Mr. Peterson and this community taught us what real strength looks like. The council chamber erupted in applause when Spike announced that the Road Raiders were officially changing their name to the Veterans Honor Guard and dedicating themselves to community service. Harold's influence had come full circle. The same principles he had taught to soldiers decades ago were now shaping a new generation. 1 month later, the town organized a special ceremony. The mayor presented Harold with a key to the city, but the most touching moment came when Spike stepped forward with a shadow box containing his grandfather's military photos, including the one with Harold. Sir, Spike said, his voice strong and clear, my grandfather always said that the most important lessons he learned weren't about fighting, but about being a man of honor. You taught him that, and through him, you taught me too. Just took me a while to learn it. Harold accepted the shadow box with misty eyes. The photo showed him, decades younger, standing with a group of recruits, including Spike's grandfather. They were all smiling, proud in their uniforms. As the ceremony ended, motorcycles could be heard approaching. But now, instead of bringing fear, the sound brought smiles. The Veterans Honor Guard, led by Spike, performed a perfectly coordinated ride-by salute, their bikes gleaming in the sunlight. Harold stood on his porch that evening, looking at his restored garden and the peaceful street. Mrs. Jenkins brought over her signature apple pie, and Jenny from the diner stopped by with coffee for everyone. The veterans and former raiders sat together on Harold's lawn, sharing stories and laughter. The American flag waved gently in the breeze above them, a symbol not just of freedom, but of the power of wisdom, patience, and the courage to change. Harold smiled, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating an enemy, but from turning them into friends.